There's nothing quite so compelling as a telephone ringing in the middle of the night. Nothing wakes us up, commands our attention like a telephone by our bed ringing at 2 a.m. For parents with teenagers, for doctors on call, for ministers, the phone ringing in the middle of the night is usually not a good thing. Usually means someone's in trouble. Sometimes it's a mistake. We leap into action, fumble with a light, try to get fully awake in seconds, answer the phone, brace ourselves for the bad news, and a voice says, "Is Ralph there?" With irritation, but also with some relief, we reply, "No, Ralph is not here at the moment. In fact, Ralph is never here. You've got the wrong number." And we try to go back to sleep. There's nothing so compelling as a telephone ringing in the middle of the night. I can remember most of these calls. The calls that woke me up, the calls late at night from hospice saying he's passed. A call from a cousin saying he thought he was having a heart attack, and he was. A call from a church member in despair crying that her house was on fire. Sometimes, very rarely, but sometimes it's good news. One member called saying that they finally had a kidney for her and that she must get to the hospital in Charleston right away for the transplant. We like getting those kinds of calls no matter what time. Got one of those calls on Christmas Eve this year, or I guess it was Christmas morning. I had not gone to bed yet. I was helping Santa pull his presents out of the sack to put under the tree. In fact, he's the one who handed me the phone. He handed it to me saying, "One of your friends wants you to know that he just got engaged." Calls in the middle of the night. There's nothing quite like them. The omnipresent cell phone has created a whole new reality, calls at any time of day, at any location. And these calls have brought on a new set of behaviors. Cell yell, for instance. That's when someone sits in his seat on the airplane and continues talking to someone in the office, full voice, authoritatively, at a volume audible for at least 5 rows or more. And then there's stage phoning. That's when you use cell yell in an airport or in a restaurant or on the street with no phone even visible, doing obviously very important business, making deals that can't wait in order to show everyone how important you are. When I lived in New York City, people would often walk by me talking to themselves or shouting at an invisible presence, and many of these people suffered from schizophrenia. Now when someone is talking to themselves as they pass by you without even noticing you, you wonder if they have a speaker in their ear or a receiver at their mouth because they may be on the phone. And some could argue that this 24/7 phone calling is creating another kind of schizophrenia because people do strange things with these phones. We act strange with them. They make us do strange things. A minister friend said he was performing a marriage ceremony, and as the couple was saying their vows to one another, the groom's phone began to ring. He dug into his pocket and actually answered it. It's a good thing I wasn't the minister for that thing. But then he handed it to the bride and said, "It's for you." She then proceeded to have an extended conversation with a caterer. Here's the question with cell phones. With cell phones ringing and beeping and vibrating all over the place, during meals with families, during meetings and classes and concerts and movies and weddings and funerals, on laptops and on other computers. In the midst of all of this calling, how do we recognize God's voice calling us? In our busy, noisy, fast-paced world, can we hear God calling our name? It is the subject of one of the oldest and best stories in the Bible, a story that's probably about 3,000 years old. Things were much quieter back then. The story takes place on the edge of history. Israel has barely evolved from a loose federation of tribes into a primitive nation. A man named Eli is a priest who presides over a shrine in Shiloh. This shrine is a sacred place where sacrifices are made and prayers are offered. One day, an older couple named Hannah and Elkanah bring a child to the shrine. Hannah had always wanted children, but she was barren for many, many years. She and Elkanah were old and had given up on the possibility of having children. But one day, to her great joy and great surprise, Hannah turns up pregnant. She and Elkanah named their son Samuel. And in gratitude for this blessing, Hannah takes Samuel, probably 4 or 5 years old at the time, and presents him to God at Eli's shrine. And Samuel becomes Eli's helper, his apprentice. And as you heard in our scripture reading today, in the middle of the night, God calls young Samuel, but Samuel doesn't know it is God calling. And there's a wonderful exchange between old Eli and young Samuel. If you have children or have been around children or have ever kept a child overnight, you know that sooner or later you'll be in bed sleeping, and all of a sudden you're aware that somebody is standing by your bed. It's an exhilarating experience. It'll put a charge in you. I can't sleep, says the child. I had a bad dream, or I heard something. I'm scared of the boogeyman. And you say something like old Eli said to Samuel, it'll be all right. Go back to bed. It'll be okay. Besides, you're not alone. God is with you. Now, there is a larger story happening in this biblical text. You see, Eli's sons, his priestly successors, they are scoundrels. And they are uninterested in continuing their father's work. And so part of what is going on in this old story is God choosing someone outside of the normal channels. An unexpected, unlikely one, a very young one, to do God's work. And Samuel, of course, grows up and becomes Israel's first great prophet. He's the one who anoints Israel's first king, King Saul. And then he's the one who anoints the second king of Israel, King David. This little boy who heard God calling him in the middle of the night. And so how do we recognize the voice of God? How do we know if God is calling our name? I believe God speaks to us in many, many different ways. Sometimes God's voice is heard in the form of an A in your favorite course in college. Sometimes God speaks through an F as well. Sometimes God speaks through our friends and through our dreams. But I believe the best way to hear God's voice is to be quiet and still. Little Samuel is in bed at night. It's quiet when he hears the voice. He then gets agitated and goes to Eli. And as you know, this happens 3 or 4 times. And Eli finally realizes that Samuel may be hearing the voice of God. And so what does Eli tell Samuel to do? Listen, Samuel. Go back to bed and be still. Be quiet and listen. And if you hear the voice again, say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." That is, your servant isn't talking. Your servant isn't being distracted by a cell phone or a computer or by a television or by work. Your servant is being still and quiet and listening. Time and time again, the Scriptures tell us how important this is. Psalm 46, "Be still and know that I am God." Elijah goes up on a mountain to try to find God, and he finally discovers God where? In a still, small voice. Jesus was constantly going off by himself to be still and to spend quiet time with God. This month, Wayne Bland became our new chairman of our church council after Helen Downing filled that position so beautifully for many years. The council met this past week, and at the end of the meeting, Wayne asked us to be quiet together for a moment before we went home. So often we start our meetings with some quiet or with prayer, but I haven't been to many meetings where we have been quiet at the end. Usually we say a quick prayer or a benediction, and everyone is off and running. But it did my soul good the other night to be quiet at the end of the meeting to prepare to go home. And I imagine the other council members felt the same way. You know, Ash Wednesday comes early this year. Easter is early in the year this year. Ash Wednesday, the start of Lent, begins February 10th. It's right around the corner. And we will again be having our Taizé services on Wednesday evenings at 7 o'clock during Lent. These are special services. They are a great way to practice the presence of God in stillness and in silence. It will help you hear God calling your name. So I encourage you to come to the Taizé services. Another thing to keep in mind as we listen to God calling us to do something is to be aware of the persistent nudging, the persistent calling. One of the things I like about the story of Samuel is that the voice is not immediately recognizable as God. It takes God 4 times to get through to Samuel. And I think that's how God gets through to most of us, with this persistent nudging time and time again. When I moved to New York City in 1981 to be an actor, I walked into a church that was like no other I had attended in my life. After being welcomed by the ushers and greeters, I looked upon a congregation that was so diverse, rich and poor, black and white and Asian, and about every kind of people you can imagine. Jew and Gentile, straight and gay, and they all looked excited about being there together. And then the minister stood up and spoke about a faith and a spirituality that helps us in our everyday living. And I said to myself, this is wonderful. I'd love to be a minister at a church like this. I thought I might be hearing God calling. A year later, in 1982, my stepfather died in a boating accident. It reminded me that if you want to do something in life, don't postpone it. You don't know if you have tomorrow. And so I thought I might be hearing God calling again to go ahead and go to seminary. But I didn't do it. A year or so later, I was in a small apartment in Queens, watching a special program about Martin Luther King Jr. on a tiny 16-inch black and white television. I was so moved by what I had seen that after the program was over, I picked up the phone and called Sherry, my wife, who I was dating at the time, and said, I think I need to go to seminary. But I still wasn't sure it was the right thing to do. Wasn't sure it was God's voice I was hearing. And then a year or so later, the minister of the church I was attending, Dr. Arthur Caliandro, had to have triple bypass heart surgery. One of the associate ministers told me that Arthur was about to get out of the hospital and wondered if I could help Arthur and his wife get to their apartment. And so I went to the hospital and got Arthur's belongings and then hailed a cab and helped Arthur and his wife get into the cab, and Arthur sat up in the front seat with the driver. His wife, Gloria, and I sat in the back seat. And as we were driving to his Manhattan apartment, Arthur turned around, sore chest and all, and said, Billy, what's happening with you? What's going on in your life? And I briefly shared with him that I was thinking about going into the ministry. And Arthur and his wife Gloria thought that was wonderful, but I shared with him that I was having difficulty letting go of theater. When we reached his apartment, Arthur said, why don't we go upstairs and talk about it? Arthur, in a sense, was my Eli. He helped me recognize that it was God calling me, but it took 4 times, just as it did for Samuel, before I felt it was the right step, that it was what God wanted me to do. I believe that's how God works most of the time, through a process, through a series of calls. And so be attentive to those persistent nudges in your life. Remember how God called Moses? Through a burning bush, through a flame that wouldn't die. Do you have a fire in you that won't go out? A flame, a burning desire that won't die. That may be God calling you. So Eli tells us to listen. In George Bernard Shaw's play on the life of Joan of Arc, there is a scene in which the Archbishop and King Charles are interrogating Joan. The Archbishop asks, how do you know you are right? And Joan says, my voices. Oh, your voices, says the king. You hear voices. Well, why don't the voices come to me? I'm the king, not you. And Joan says, they do come, but you do not hear them. It may be that God is calling you to spend more time with your children. Or that God is calling you to spend more time with your spouse. Or to spend more time taking care of your health. Or to have that difficult conversation you need to have with a friend or relative. Or to spend more time helping those in need. Or to be more involved with justice issues. Or to spend more time in prayer. I don't know what it is, but I do know God is calling your name, and God is calling mine. I hope that each of us will make time every day to say, "Here I am, Lord. Speak. For your servant is listening." Amen. Thank you for being here today to worship together. I want to thank the choir for their wonderful ministry each week. Boy, they're good. I want to thank the handbell choir who were wonderful today. We don't get to hear them often, but it was wonderful to hear them today. And I want to mention that Beth Balance, who's in the choir and handbell choir, this is her last Sunday before she goes off on her adventure, so be sure to get a hug from her. We won't do this most Sundays, and I've never done it before after the final hymn. But after what Wayne did at our church council meeting, and after what the sermon was about, let us spend a moment in silence before the benediction. And now may we leave this place with the peace of Christ in our minds and the love of God in our hearts. Amen.